scripture today comes from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 7, verses 1 through 8, then 14 and 15, and then 21 through 23. If you'd like to follow along, I'll give you a minute to find it in your pew Bible, or it is on the front of the bulletin. Let us be attentive to a word from the Gospel. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesies rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." Continue 14 and 15. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." 21 to 23. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. This is the word of God. Let us pray. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts here today be holy and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. So this is one of those fun texts, lasciviousness, slander, pride, blah, He just go ahead and throws a list out there for you all to enjoy, for us all to really enjoy. And it can be a little tricky, a little difficult in some ways. It's difficult when we have to deal and when we're positioned to look at a conversation Jesus was having with the Pharisees. We're easily confronted with our own hypocrisy that we do every single day or we can fall into. And we can be convicted and knocked down a peg when looking at it. And that's an easy route to run with this text. Just focus on hypocrisy. We're all hypocrites, etc., etc., etc. But let's try something else here. So let's take a look at this conversation with the Pharisees. So at this point in Mark, because Mark is short, Jesus has been around for a while. Jesus has performed miracles. Jesus has taught. Jesus has healed, and etc., etc. He's went in and he's prophesied. And let us remember that Jesus was a Jew. This is important. Jesus was a Jew, and he wasn't just a Jew, but he was a very, very faithful and good Jew. All right? So he is reading and interpreting Scripture in a different manner than the Pharisees. He is focused on these different pieces of the Torah and how they should be enacted than the Pharisees. Brothers and sisters, Jesus was not the first Christian. That'd be Peter. Okay? Even then, he was probably a Jew. He was a Jew who was a follower of the way, still stuck to Jewish tradition. So, that is important to remember. So these Pharisees, they have heard about his healings and his teachings and his miracles, and they've probably come into contact with him. And they come with a large group from Jerusalem. So, the big dogs, if you will, the important ones. And they come and they're like, let's go check out this Jesus guy. And at this point, we don't have, let's check this Jesus guy out so we can kill him. We just have, let's go see what he's about. And as for Jesus is doing what Jesus always does. Eat. Right? Come on, Jesus is always at the table. Always eating. He's always breaking bread with his friends. Jesus would have been a really good Presbyterian. So he's gathered at the dinner table with his friends and disciples, and they're eating and they're taking in a meal, but there's one problem. His disciples didn't wash their hands. They didn't cleanse themselves. Now, this cleansing is less like I went to the sink, got some soap and washed my hands, and got them all clean so they weren't dirty anymore. This was more of a baptismal type cleansing. It was a ritual. All right, and they did it with, as you got the little parentheses in there, they did it with their utensils, and they did it with everything. It was ritualistic cleansing. Everything had to be clean because it would defile you. It would make you bad. It would make you unclean, which means you're unfit to be part of the society, which means you have to leave the community till you're cleansed again. So, the customary tradition of cleansing was not done. Now, the scribes and Pharisees noticed this. Of course they noticed this. This is ingrained in them. This is their tradition. This is who they are. The leadership of the faith notices and says, whoa, what are they doing? What are they doing eating without taking part in the ritualistic cleansing? It bothers them. Of course it bothers them. Here's the problem. And I'm not giving Pharisees and all of them an easy pass, but we too often slip into this good-bad mentality, right? Jesus is the good guy, the Pharisees are the bad guys, they're going to fight, right? Evil versus good kind of thing. The Pharisees are holding true to the tradition and the faith. Not necessarily bad. It really upsets the way they do things to see them not taking part in the ritual. If we don't do things a certain way quite often, how much does that bother us? Does that make you a bad guy or a bad lady? No, we have traditions and ways, and we get into those things. It's when those things become more divine to us than the divine that becomes the problem. It's something that they did and come about over time. Of course it did. You're wandering through the desert for 40 years. At some point, you're going to make a divine ritualistic law, and they make it a ritual so that people will take part in it to be clean. Because if you don't clean your hands when you're wandering through the desert, picking manna off the ground and eating it, you're going to get sick. And then you're going to what? Die. Okay? So they're concerned with the tribe of Israel at this point. So they make a ritual, cleanse yourselves. And that ritual becomes and is written into law, divine law, like a Ten Commandment kind of thing. We got to do these rituals because we got to, it's good to be clean. Did anybody have a parent who said cleanliness is next to godliness? Right? This cleansing was important. It kept the tribe alive because if one person gets some sort of bacterial infection or virus, then what happens? Another, and there's no medicine. Then you have the bubonic plague on your hands. And you've wiped out the entire tribe. It makes sense. It doesn't make them bad people for following a code or a ritual. It just makes them a little stuck. But here's what happens with them. That ritual and that code became more important than God. That's what Isaiah was saying. Now that we're settled in the Holy Land, in the wonderful place, a land of flowing milk and honey, your rituals, the traditions have become more important than God and doing what God is telling us to do. And so Jesus realizes this, and he knows that in that moment. He says, you guys are hypocrites. You put the tradition before you put God. You put that thing, that ritual, higher than what God has been telling you to do. It's the same thing that happened with exile. Over and over again, they put the ritual, the tradition, more important than the orphan and the widow and those things. I mean, that's just Isaiah said it over and over again. Jeremiah said it over and over again. You guys are going into exile because you haven't cared for other people. You haven't done good things. You haven't lived the way you're supposed to. You've taken the ritual, cleansed yourself, and called that good enough. Calls them together and he says, listen. And this is a stand against the powers that be kind of statement. What you eat and put into your body doesn't affect you. You go down to the market and you eat that meat sacrificed to whomever. Doesn't matter. Paul even takes this stance. If it doesn't bother you, eat the meat sacrificed to Athena. Nobody cares. If it bothers someone next to you, then don't do it, because then you got to worry about their faith too. It's what comes out of the person, out of the heart, the intentions, what comes from within to out that'll defile a person. The action or inaction that defiles the person, not what we eat. This is a loaded text. There's a lot. Jesus says, is doctrine more important than God? No. Is tradition more important than God? No. We have been having this conversation since it all started. Literally, since it all started. It started there with this conversation. If you think back to it, we've had reformations and we've had church splits, and you know what those are all over? Human doctrine. Seriously. We reformed from the Catholic Church because they were selling indulgences, and they said, you could buy your way into heaven. And you know, Luther said, no, you can't. That's obscene. You're robbing the people. You've put this human doctrine you've created and your corruption before God. God saves through grace. And then Calvin went on to say further, and Knox and Zwingli and all those fun names. And we keep doing this. When we came to the United States, when we came to the colonies, the Puritans said, well, we've got to be this certain way. And then all of a sudden this thing happens called the Great Awakening and says, whoa, you guys are more focused on being clean in a certain way than you are about God, and it needs to be this way. Boop. Doctrine versus God. Doctrine versus God. Doctrine versus God. This is the conversation. And it keeps happening. It's happening today. And that's the beautiful thing about being Presbyterian, because we are reformed and still being reformed. So we're going to have the conversation of human tradition versus Scripture, doctrine versus God. Does that fit? Jesus starts the conversation. This is something we need to be aware of. Is this tradition for the sake of tradition, or is this tradition because it holds up and lifts up the divine? Has this tradition become divine over the divine for us? It makes us hypocrites. It makes us those who speak of God with our lips, but live out human doctrine. And I've heard this conversation before by numerous people. Who's heard this one? I don't want to go to church because it's full of hypocrites. Anyone? Bleh. There's a great quote I read when I was preparing for this sermon that says, yep, and there's room for one more. Or the other one that says, don't go hunting the church for hypocrites, just go home and look in the mirror. We are hypocrites because of our sin. It just does that to us. You know, I don't know anyone in here who sins and are like, oh, I'm going to sin. Yeah, love it. It's the best thing ever. I think we sin and then we go, oh, my anger got the best of me. I didn't think that through. We label that list. It's not, I don't know anyone in here who's purposefully out there like just sinning for the sake of sinning. Put you guys pretty high up, okay? Feel good about that. But we do it anyways, right? And that's hypocritical, because we're like, you shouldn't judge someone. And